Hey, Steve, it's good to see you. Good to chat with you again. Thanks for spending time with me today.
It's always great to see you. Love the hat.
Thank you. Aloha from Hawaii. Just to give a bit of context for the folks that are listening as to who Steve is and how we connected. Steve is an ICF certified executive coach. He's a writer, podcaster, and teacher. He's also the creator of a cool new podcast and newsletter called Where the Road Bends, where he focuses on personal evolutions and life transitions. That's actually the context where Steve and I first connected, having gone through some major transitions of our own. When he's not coaching and creating, he tinkers on side projects such as the Ultimate Annual Review, which is a free actionable blueprint to conduct your own self-paced annual review. For anyone who's interested in rigorous self-knowledge, give it a look. It's fantastic. It's a form of self-authoring that is really powerful. Prior to becoming an executive coach, Steve was a partner at a multi-billion-dollar VC firm. He lived that life. He's been there. He's done that. He's worked at startups and larger companies as well. And combined with his deep personal experience navigating big life transitions, Steve is one hell of a resource for entrepreneurs thinking about turning the page to a new chapter in their life, which is what we're going to focus on today. It's for the folks that have this gut feeling like it's time for something else, but I'm not quite sure and I don't know what to do about it and how to move through that. That's what we're going to talk about. All right. So to kick it off, let's start with how you describe your coaching practice. Your tagline of the practice says, quote, "I help high performers in midlife manifest their next calling." I want you to talk about that. What does that mean and how did you end up there?
Yeah, I'd love to start by in reverse order where I answer, how did I end up here? And I think probably makes the most sense is to just share how I even got exposed to coaching, which was in 2013. I was a principal at one of the top early stage funds in New York. And I happened to hear an episode of This Week in Startups with Jason Calacanis and Jerry Colonna, the legendary executive coach and founder of Reboot. And there was just something that Jerry said that kind of just like opened my eyes. And the thing that struck me was, on one hand, I had a portfolio full of founders that were telling me they were crushing it. And my wife and all of my friends who are founders telling me how hard it was. As people say, running a startup is like eating glass. I was like, okay. And then here's Jerry that's kind of validate. And I was like, wait a minute, there seems to be this huge disconnect between my friends and my portfolio founders. And so I just became enamored with the idea of coaching. Fast forward 2015, I got sober. So started thinking a lot more about service and helping other people, obviously investing in my consciousness, meditation, things of that nature. And then between 2016 and 2017, there's just this feeling I'm not where I should be, feeling like a fish out of water. In fact, I remember the day that I found out that I had made partner at the firm I was at. I was like, I wasn't excited. It was like this, almost like this sinking feeling of like, fuck, here I am, like they're wanting to celebrate with me and I just do not want to celebrate.
Yeah, and I just got pulled into 10 more years.
Well, exactly, because of the fund cycles. And so not even a year later, about 6 months later, I walked into my partner's office and I resigned and they were floored. And they said, well, what are you going to do? And naturally I was like, oh, I don't know, like going to take a little bit of time off and probably just jump into venture, maybe join a seed fund, maybe start my own thing, maybe coaching. Right. And this little idea in the back of my head. And even a few years before that, I said to my wife, I think I want to be a coach one day. And she said, oh, you can do that when you retire later in life. And what I do now is provide the support for people that I wish I had that day in 2017, when I knew what I was doing wasn't aligned with who I was becoming. And I had no idea how to navigate it. And sure enough, the 6 years between resigning and ultimately deciding that I was going to help high performers manifest their next calling in life was a very windy road filled with fits and starts and thinking I wanted one thing, but really discovered I wanted something else. And it was just this constant tension between what do I want and who am I becoming, and not necessarily knowing how to reconcile the two. And so it's a long way of saying, to like really get, manifest, to use that word, actually has a lot more depth, because the way I think about helping someone manifest, it's grieving, it's recovering, it's envisioning, right? It's around discovery. And the manifest is in some ways at the final step in which you're now able to bring forth an entire new identity, a new way of being, but it encompasses those other stages, if you will. The other thing I would say is that the calling piece, like I specifically say, manifest your next calling. To me, I don't believe in one vocation. I don't believe in one calling in your life. For me, like for over a decade, my calling was to be an institutional investor until it wasn't, right? And now my calling is this. And so that calling can take a number of different forms, ranging from, I'm working with a founder right now who's super talented. He took a job and a job because he's at a point in his life where he has a young family, has a mortgage. And he said, you know what? I've been grinding for 10 years. I'm going to chill out. I'm going to work a 9 to 5. I'm going to invest in my health. I'm going to invest in my family, and I'm going to gather the strength to figure out like what's the next move without having to bet the farm on it. So anyhow, it was a long-winded way of answering your questions, but that's how I got here and effectively what I help high performers navigate.
I've had a similar experience, when 3-4 years ago, when I really started undergoing a significant personal change. And like you mentioned, I felt that existential gnawing inside of me. It's not like intellectual thing of, oh yeah, I guess I should move to a new chapter in my life and do something different. It doesn't work that way. It's just this persistent sensation and feeling of sorts that's just asking you to listen to it and allow it to play out. And when that kicked in, it was the same. I start down this path and I have no idea where this path is going and I have no guidance. And now in retrospect, when I look back at how the journey has unfolded, I can sort of put some framing to it, because with myself and with others, I've noticed that there are very consistent patterns in this sort of journey off of the first mountain of your life into this valley of uncertainty that then leads you to the next mountain of your life. And so I'd love to get your perspective, especially because you've seen this. You have a lot of reps with this with other folks.
I've lived it too.
Yeah. Imagine I were to come to you. I'm a high performer, executive, or founder. And I said, okay, I feel this existential calling. I'm answering the call to listen to it and begin a new chapter in my life. But, what should I expect? What are some high level expectations that you might set in saying, okay, here's how things are going to play out, and here's what I want you to keep in mind?
Yeah. Well, when someone comes to me, before I start determining what the path forward looks like in terms of how we potentially partner up and co-create a future together, I will typically spend a lot of time just asking them questions and listening. And the reason why I do that is trying to understand where they are in the transition process. And so, as I'm sure you can imagine, Andy, I'll connect with entrepreneurs that are still in their companies, that are sensing something's up, all the way through, hey, I've been basically on sabbatical for a year and a half, and now I'm ready to figure out what's next. 2, and this is actually someone I just started working with who's just a phenomenally talented guy who spent the last year basically searching and now knows exactly what he's going to go and do, which is start a massive fund, multi-billion-dollar fund. And he's never been an institutional investor before. And so he has partners, of course. And so he's like, I'm transitioning into an entirely new role. So as you can see, it spans a pretty wide gamut from, so before I can even set expectations, I need to understand, okay, well, where are you? What's going through your mind right now? What questions are coming up? What emotions are you feeling? What are the things that you're saying to you? It's like really trying to understand their, what I call like internal context and what their way of being is. And then that helps me ultimately determine where they are, right? And I'm a student of a lot of different models of change and transition. It's like something I do on nights and weekends, and my wife doesn't understand it. There's a number of models that I really love, and one of which is called the cycle of renewal by Frederick Hudson, who is the founder of the Hudson Institute of Coaching, based, I want to say, out of Santa Barbara. And I love the cycle of renewal. And I think that it's pretty multidimensional in a way and has a little bit more depth than, say, the traditional 3-stage model of transition. And so what I do is in my own mind, I've constructed kind of where they are in their process, not assuming too much, because I, as a coach and someone that's responsible for guiding someone, I always want to be mindful of my own projections. So to me, my first job is to first assess. And then once I've assessed and we've come to some sort of agreement around where they are in the process, that's when we can start setting expectations. And to me, I think the biggest expectation that I set, and this is probably going to be something that I emphasize over and over again today as we unpack this topic, is that often takes much longer than you think. And it's not because I want the other person that I'm working with, my partner, to be uncomfortable for long periods of time. It just takes a while to get through all the different layers and understand who they are and what they want. Yeah, that's a big expectation that I set. And then there are a number of others, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, and there's something interesting about this sort of 6, 7, 8-year time frame, which is just an observation where I know of a few folks where it played out in a similar time frame. In reading the story in the background of much more popular folks who have undergone significant transitions, like Eckhart Tolle, the author of The Power of Now.
Changed my life.
And when he described his process, there was a point where he said, I had his big existential breakdown, and then 7 years later, all of a sudden I was a spiritual teacher. Yeah. This is not a couple months, 1 year, 2 year sort of thing. It does take more time than you would expect.
And what I would say is one of the things that I really appreciate about Hudson's model is that he makes a very clear distinction between what's known as and I don't know if this is exactly his words, but a real transition, which is basically a full loop around the cycle, or what he would call a micro transition, which is basically, it's almost like continuing that life chapter, but expressing it in a new way based on what you've discovered about yourself. For example, it could be, in my case, there were a number of times where I had micro transitions as an investor, where I knew I wanted to stay in the profession until I didn't. And so what I would say to those listening is a micro transition oftentimes will probably take I don't want to set a time frame, but generally, let's say it takes about 1.5 years to fully undergo a micro transition, whereas a real transition where you're fundamentally transforming your identity and who you are, that often takes 3, 5, 6+ years.
Yeah.
So I set that expectation at the beginning.
And then other than that aspect of it, which for a few folks, like the common response I get when I also share that expectation is, oh, really? This valley between two mountains is broader than you would imagine. But other than that, one of the questions I want to ask is what else is going to suck about this process? What's going to be hard? Because it's difficult. It's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be full of suffering for everyone, because to your point, the magnitude of change somebody undergoes can be different from one person to the next. But from my own process, there are definitely some parts in it that just flat out sucked. And so if you were to set some expectations or anticipations around what those might be, what comes to mind?
I just latched on to the word expectation because there was one other expectation that I wanted to set or articulate, which is this, with something that I say, and this is something that came from my teacher, one of my teachers and now coach, Steve March, who runs coaching institute called Alethea. And he preaches this notion of unfoldment, and over what I think is largely, at least in the West where we are today, personal development, personal growth. And he would call it, as like his way of articulating it, is more personal unfoldment, right? Self-unfoldment. And I really, as an expectation, I encourage those that I work with to really appreciate this idea of unfoldment. And so those that are listening, what is unfoldment? Unfoldment is the ability to move through the world exactly as you are with your experience and kind of feel into where the path is taking you, as opposed to looking 3 years out and being like, I want to create a unicorn. It's more of like a trusting of the universe to show you the next step forward. It's a concept that, I've been working on this essay that's hasn't seen the light of day in a while. I haven't put it aside, but it's this idea of like portals where you're like, oh, I want to go and explore this topic. Let's say the topic is generative AI, just because we're going to use that. Once you open that door and you open up a portal and you step in, you start finding new connections, associations. And so it's a long way of saying I set the expectation to embrace unfolding. And that doesn't mean where you're literally not in control. I mean, as you and I both know, we're not in control of a whole lot, but it's this idea of how do you mindfully move through the world such that the next 2, 3, 5 steps aren't maybe visible, but like we're being conscious of how we're moving through the world today, next week, maybe the week after, and trusting that you're going to learn about yourself. You're going to find new opportunities that excite you. You're going to try on new identities. You're going to experiment and you're going to learn. And so if that's another expectation. So I'm sorry to hijack your question about what sucks about this process, but I think it's a really important expectation that I set where we're not going from point A to point B, because in my mind, there's no point B. We don't even know what point B is. We have to trust in ourselves and in our process that a point B is naturally going to emerge, and maybe a point C and a point D that we could have never even have guessed, because we're willing to be slow and naturally feel into what's unfolding in front of us.
Yeah. And I really keyed on to use the word invisible. And I just had a conversation yesterday with a former coworker who's going through quite a bit of change. And going back to sort of the 2 mountains and a valley analogy, is what I said to her is like, the thing about the first mountain of life that you're on in this achiever path is that the mountain's clear because it's been defined for us. Follow these steps, get these grades, go to these colleges, get these titles, earn this money. And then now that you're answering this call to say, you know what, I'm stepping off of this first mountain and I'm going to enter this valley where it's going to be uncomfortable because I need to give myself the space to sort of transition away from that first mountain and allow the unfolding of desires and interests and what have you to take place. But the thing that sucks about the second mountain, but is also amazing about it, is that the second mountain isn't clear at all. It doesn't have a defined shape, because, and that's what it juxtaposes with that first mountain, where the world defined that first mountain. You climb that ladder. The second mountain doesn't have any shape yet. And it turns out that you get to define what it is because it's your own unique path. And so sticking in that analogy, it's like the second mountain is going to be shrouded in clouds for a while. And you're going to be socked in the fog looking for a trail to it. And that's where this surrender to the unfolding and taking it one day at a time is really important.
Yeah, I love the metaphor because I used to be a mountaineer when I lived in Seattle many years ago. And I used to think about climbing Mount Rainier where I would do these day hikes up to base camp, or occasionally I would summit. And what would happen is you'd come to paradise and it would just be the thickest fog, and you'd have a sense as to where you were going, and it's being able to navigate through the fog. And I think that's part of the reason, to use that as a segue into why this can suck. Right? Because if you think about an entrepreneur, and I'll take the liberty to make this claim, given that I'm married to one, most of my friends are founders, and I've worked with dozens, if not countless founders over the years, is this idea of control, right? And when you're in the fog, there's a sense of not having control, right? There's a sense of disorientation. Where am I, right? Which I'll unpack even further in a second. And there's also an aspect of like starting to feel irrelevant. I just spent all this time building this company and attaching my identity to it, and now I'm out. And what does that say about me? And so I think that's a big part. And I don't think that's even something that just entrepreneurs experience. I think this is any sort of high performer that is undergoing some form of transition. There's this sense of, am I losing my edge? Am I becoming irrelevant? Is my skill set eroding? And so as a result of that, being in the fog and not necessarily knowing who you're going to be, what the opportunity is going to look like through the fog, it's very discomforting. And so I think that's another thing. It also sucks, as we talked about, it just takes a while. And then I think there's an unspoken one, which I have the privilege of having visibility into, is oftentimes these types of experiences uncover, whether you want to call them our trigger patterns, conditioned tendencies, where we start to behave in more primal type ways. Because at the end of the day, I'm using we, because what ultimately happens is we think that our survival is at threat.
Yes.
This is a question that I learned from my teacher, Jim Detmer, and Diana Chapman at Conscious Leadership Group. I studied under them for over a year. And I believe they learned this from Hale Dwaskin, but it's something depending where in the coaching relationship and the context, which is like, what's at threat? And usually it's control, security, approval, or unity. This idea of like feeling like you're connected to someone or something other than yourself. And so to me, what happens is, if we're conscious, or at least doing the work, we start to identify these patterns, and it can be really uncomfortable because we think unconsciously that our survival is at threat. Mm-hmm. And I would say the last reason, I'm sure there are others that we could unpack, which is these existential questions just start rising to the surface. Often, what do they call the hour of the wolf at 3 a.m., right? Which is like, what am I going to do with my life? Who am I becoming? Is this it? Am I washed up? I don't have to continue to name all those questions, but that's what happens. And so you have to start to sit with this existential angst, these really big questions that, by the way, probably don't have answers to them. And founders, because, we live in a rational society, rational world that we think our way out of things, you can get lost in these.
Yeah, it's the wrong tool for the job.
Exactly. I love this in terms of, why does it suck? Let's take another transition model. Let's take William Bridges, which used the 3-stage model. What he would say, it starts with the ending. And in the ending, it's disengage, right? You disengage from the environment that you were in, which is, if you think about like old rituals, they would, a rite of separation, you would get fully taken out of the village that you spent your life in. So disengagement, that's a big one, because now you sort of are starting to get a different perspective as an outsider. The next one is dismantle, where you start to dismantle a lot of the old behaviors, rituals, and things of that nature. And so that can also be disorienting because you go from being in a company, having all of these norms and values and rituals, frankly, right? One-on-ones, meetings, to now having none of that can be very disorienting. Then you begin to disidentify where it's okay, like I'm no longer this person that I was, but I'm not quite who I'm becoming. And so that's a big part of the ending process. Disenchantment. And I think that these aren't linear. I think that these can happen at different points in the process, but even disenchantment, like it took me probably, I don't know, a year after leaving the venture world, like really leaving institutional venture until I was disenchanted where I was like, oh, all this was bullshit.
Yeah.
Right. And so it depends. Like at a certain point, you might get disenchanted with the world that you came from, like where you start to actually challenge the beliefs and the stories that have been handed to you for so long.
And even disenchanted with the process of transformation itself. You start thinking in that spinning, it's like, what is this shit all about? This is just another cult. These people don't know what they're talking about. This sounds all make-believe. What is this language of the journey to the self and all? Like, what is this crap? There's a disenchantment with the process itself, too.
Completely. And then what Bridges would say, the fifth one is disorientation. What happens is you go from having very clear markers of progress and success, and now you're like, oh, I don't know where I am. I don't know what's up. I don't know what's down. I can't even make sense of this. It's actually something that comes up quite a bit with those that I work with, particularly those that are in the middle stage, whether you want to call it the liminal space, messy middle, there's a lot of different ways to frame it. Disorientation's a big one because they don't necessarily know where they are and there's no clear lines of demarcation to help them understand where I think the fog is like a perfect example. It's like, I actually have a perfect analogy. When the first time I set foot on Mount Rainier, it was literally a blizzard. I shit you not. We couldn't even get up to Camp Muir, but it was in April. It was crazy. Just crazy snow. I mean, basically whiteout conditions. We were roped up. And like, there was no lines of demarcation. We didn't know if we were 100 yards from base camp, a mile from base camp. It was just, we were literally in the fog, in the snow. And so that's often what can happen. So that's why it sucks.
That's exactly. Man, I love that, the framing where you were talking about, I'm going to have to study that more, but the disengagement, disenchantment, what was running through my mind when you mentioned that was the examples of how that was happening during my own process. I had the disengagement, which was in making that first decision to go and tell the partners, like, I'm out. That's a hard decision. But then following that, it was interesting to see how everything you mentioned and these different transformation systems you mentioned, they talk about this disillusionment and this loss of importance and self and esteem and connection. And for example, I moved out of Silicon Valley. I was back home in a small blue collar farming community, just getting in touch with my roots again. And I would chat with people on the street or in coffee shops and they'd say, so what do you do? And for a while, even though I'd stepped away from it, I'd say, oh, venture capital, right? I was still sort of attached to that. And I didn't know what else to say, but it evolved over time where then there became a point where it was like I had to fight the resistance to let go to these old titles and attachments. And it took months before I finally was able to say, yeah, I'm just in between jobs. Or I would use this one, which made me sound fancy. It's like, oh, I retired from tech. Total ego bullshit. And then it took me several more months to get over that and realize, like, why am I saying that? And then here it was, like, I remember 3 years later when having a conversation in a coffee shop. And it was the first time when I organically said, oh, I do mental health advocacy. That's how long it took. Like, it's in all those little ways. It's in the trimming of your contact list in your phone. It's in the trimming of your connections in social media. It's in all these little ways. It's in the change of your title on your Twitter profile. It's in all these little ways where you allow yourself to like cut away the fat of that old life and sort of move through it. So it's just really interesting that you shared those framings because it fit my personal experience almost
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, I appreciate you sharing, and it actually really resonates. What was interesting is so I ended up leaving Primary Venture Partners in 2019. So what happened is I left RRE in 2017, took a bit of time off, started training as a coach, took a bunch of different courses, started coaching on the side, and Primary convinced me to join as a full-time partner. I did that for almost 18 months. And finally, I was like, this just doesn't feel like me. And I remember coming out of Primary and being like, I'm going to coach full time and I'm going to go raise an angel fund.
Right.
And I'm going to go do this. And I was still, talk about dismantle, I was still running a lot of the same habits and schedules and routine, packed schedule back to back from 8 in the morning to 6 to 7 at night. And what's interesting is then COVID hit. And my family and I moved from New York City to our home in the Catskills. And we were up there for 18 months and just disengaging, just leaving New York City and getting into nature. It was like, oh, this is actually what my life can be like. Like, I don't have to pack my schedule every day and I don't have to run around town and take pitch meetings. And through that 18-month period, I went from coaching part-time, more than part-time, called 75%, to investing like 25%, sometimes a little bit more. And by the time I got home, I was like, I'm done with investing because I had reoriented my entire life and way of being because I disengaged and I had like enough of a taste of like, there's actually an alternative way of being, and it's actually way better.
It's so much better. At first, it sucks because
it's awful. Yeah. It's awful.
I mean, our minds, our bodies have been conditioned to a certain way and to a pace. There are public examples of this. So take Michael Phelps. When the guy wins a couple dozen gold medals, he's one of the greatest Olympic athletes of all time, and then goes through many years of severe depression, suicidality following the Olympics. And the question is like, why? People would, at a surface level, say he should be happy. And it's like, sure, he should. But like, when you have been a husky pulling a sled your whole life and pulling it at the highest level, and then all of a sudden they cut the cord on that and there's nothing left to pull, it's not like your mind quickly and immediately adjusts and says, oh, this is the new way of being. Right? It takes time sitting in that valley to allow that deprogramming to happen.
Yeah. The other thing that I experience, and I see it with a bunch of my clients, is also, it's almost on the horror movies where the villain actually gets more powerful over time and like to get that like kill shot, just like an incredible effort.
Yeah.
That's almost like what it is when an identity feels like it's on the verge of basically being banished, or not even banished, where it's time for, like, when an identity starts to be transparent and you can start to see that it's fluid, actually gets stronger and stronger.
Yeah.
And so I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the final year was my identity, where it was like, yes, I'm a coach and I'm also an angel investor. The investor persona, that identity just held on for life. And then until it was like, once it was gone, it was like, oh,
yeah.
I went like, now I'm like light in my body, feel so incredible. I can actually like move through the world in a much different way. And so I think that's also something important where, when we're going through these, we're trying on different identities. In my case, it was coach investor. In the case of some of my clients, it's author, blogger, entrepreneur. It can be a bunch of different things. Is oftentimes the identity is eventually going to be let go. Takes time where you're going to oscillate and go back and forth until it's very clear when it's ready to kind of just be with it. And then there's a grieving process. Like we haven't even talked about grieving, which I think a lot of people just skip, right? It's like, okay, I'm leaving my company, or so you see it in the tech world today where it's like, I'm leaving Stripe and now I'm starting a stealth company that already has $5 million from Sequoia.
Yeah, right. It's like, was there any transition in there whatsoever?
Yeah. And by the way, someone that's 27 years old, 32 years old, that has been at Stripe for 5 years and working for a company might be ready to go start something, right? So that's not taking away their desire to go try to build something. What I'm saying is that oftentimes we kind of rush into what's next, where I work with a lot of my clients where it's like, how can we honor and grieve what just happened? Can we just slow down and be with the heartbreak of not having the outcome that we dreamed it would be, or losing our best friend that was our co-founder, or whatever it is? Can we just be with that experience? And can we honor it? Can we celebrate it in all the ways that we've grown and matured and, what we're going to take with us? And so there's an exercise that I love to do once. One of the things is like, I'm a huge fan of rituals. And so, for example, when I decided to walk away from my institutional fund that I had raised, where I was going to integrate coaching and investing, I actually printed out the LPA and burned it as like a ritual that symbolically closes that period and allowed me to grieve it. And so I think the use of rituals, particularly around grieving, is very powerful. I also think that postmortems and retrospectives are really important, and doing them carefully, slowly, thoughtfully to really like mine it for the experience, both in terms of like what happened, but what did I believe? What did I think was reality, and what was reality really? And so I think that's another really powerful tool. There's another, I love metaphors. It's like, imagine, let's stay on the metaphor of climbing a mountain. So let's say you just got off your mountain. And this is a metaphor I use with my clients, which is, okay, you just got off a mountain. You just busted your ass for however many years. In my wife's case, she's been at it like 12 years. Okay. You have a backpack, you have a rucksack, and there's only a certain amount of inventory that can go in your rucksack. What are you keeping? What are you taking out and discarding? And what do you want to go and procure or cultivate for the next journey? That last one might not even be clear, but the idea is like, can we take an inventory so that we can at least move into the next phase with a better sense as to what it is that we need to let go, and what are we bringing with us, and what do we need to move forward?
Yeah, that's a great point, because there's a necessary amount of letting go. That may also suck because it may be more than you had initially expected or anticipated, but it's necessary because in letting it go, you're making the space to fill that old void up with something new. It's just something you have to do. It's like the equivalent of, okay, I'm hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. It's a couple thousand miles. It's going to take me 6 months. I'm not carrying all the same gear with me, because at a minimum, I'm going to transition into totally different climates. So maybe I got to drop my wet weather gear and my snow gear, and then I'm going to make more room for sort of hydration and water filtering and light gear, because I'm entering into sort of a hot valley, right? Like, it's the exact same thing. Have to let stuff go. That's an amazing point around I love the ritual, finding a way to ritualize that grieving process as part of the transition, and then inventory of what's staying and what's going.
It's interesting, going back to the expectations that I set with my clients, going back to that question, but I think it's related to the ending process in taking inventory, which is why I'm bringing this back now, which is, I also think there's a sense as to, is this person face, like, is there real burnout? Your seminal piece on what is it, when to know when, how to know when to stop.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so to me as a professional, I could be like, hey, on to the next thing and to me, it's my responsibility and job to say, hey, do we need to help you reset your nervous system Do we need to help you? And I use this word, heal and recover before going and doing the work. And sometimes these go hand in hand. But I think particularly for those founders that have been on the journey for a long time and have experienced, some form of, I'll use lowercase trauma in this experience, can we just take a pause and just understand where you are mentally, spiritually, and physically?
Yeah. Yeah. And do a reset of sorts, get that stuff out of you, rebuild, get back to a healthy place. And then in that healthy place, embark on this, what's really a steady sort of wandering process of experimentation, trying all sorts of things. And then in that process of, okay, let me try this. I've had an interest in music or whatever it may be. You try it and then you set it down and then you take a look at it and you say, is that sticking? Is that going to be part of this next mountain or not? Right? That experimentation in there, from my experience, can only be done after rest and recovery.
Yeah. And some people don't have the luxury of the rest and recovery. So I think there are ways to invest in it depending on what the runway is, so to speak. But I do believe that the space, your triumvirate of what is it? It's space, play, and
fun.
And fun.
Oh, well,
yeah, space,
play, and experimentation.
Experimentation, which, I think is essential. And to me, what I often say, especially around experimentation, which is how do you actually experiment with different identities, right? With different types of ways of being.
Well, this bleeds into my next question. And I think this would be a good place for us to, spend a bit of time on it, is these transitions, making these notable changes inevitably bumps up against the practical realities of somebody's life. And we all have different home situations, different financial situations, personal, professional. And so from your experience, how does it vary and how do you help guide somebody through this transition process when real life practical limitations or considerations exist?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of practicality and responsibilities, just to use your words, to me, there are a number of them, one of which could be aging parents and coming from a culture where you care for your parents, could be caring for kids, young kids, kids of any age. Another one could be runway. How much financial cushion do you have? Could be what's your dynamic with your partner and the agreement that you have with them in terms of, do they stay home and care for the kids? Do they have a job, health insurance, all those sorts of things. So there were real practical realities that often are involved in pretty much every client relationship that I have. I would say that the big one that often comes up is money and runway. Oftentimes the people that I work with have runway, but not infinite. And so it's how do we make progress knowing that the runway could be everything from 3 to 18 months. And as a practitioner, I have to tell them, look, this might take longer depending on what your objectives are. And we're going to hold the things, your responsibilities front and center, right? And it speaks to this former founder that I'm working with right now who decided to take a job where he's making a very good salary, has insurance, covers the mortgage, has a great quality of life. And that's not to say that I'm throwing in the towel, but I'm now stepping into my identity and a power as a father and as a husband. And he's now taking the founder identity, putting that aside, becoming an executive, but also taking these other parts of his identity and bringing them into the forefront. And the work that we're doing now as he's settling into this new role and this identity as someone that takes care of himself, which he neglected for a long time, someone that's present for his family, responsible financially, like all these new dimensions of his life. That's what we're helping him kind of lean into, because he has a lot of patterns around just wanting to work 12 hours a day, which doesn't lean into the parts of his family. And what we're also doing is to say, what could come next? Right. And so what I'm trying to say is that we can't think of transitions as some like stopping on a dime.
Right.
As we've said, they're over long periods of time. And by him moving into this company, just as an example, is just the first step to whatever this new expression of himself is going to be.
Mhm.
Whether he eventually, because he's a very creative person, whether he becomes an artist, whether he becomes a pro pickleball player, because he is a phenomenal tennis player and pickleball player, among the top in the country for his
Wow.
age group. The point being is that this is the beginning of him figuring out this unfolding, this self-unfolding. And it takes the shape in many different ways. Now, that said, there are times where I was speaking to a hedge fund executive, founder of a firm, who was talking about closing up shop for his firm with his partners. And basically, his wife was like, you need to go get another job, even though he's like, I'm done with financial services. And in that conversation, I said, at a certain point, you need to be real with your wife. First, I didn't say you need to be real. I said, you need to figure out where you're willing to go with her, which then brings up a whole host of other patterns and triggers. And because there's a part of him that doesn't want to spend another day in financial services, yet his partner and best friend
Has a
is
different
like,
set of expectations.
yeah, because we have a family, we have a mortgage, we have all these things. And so he's an entrepreneur. I feel trapped. And so these are very complicated situations that are not easy to navigate. I think the most frequent thing that I see is a prioritization of family. If there's not, enough wealth to sustain over long periods of time, if they're not post-economic, it's usually a retreat to examine what matters most to them. And 9 out of 10 times it's family and their well-being. And I'm going to basically prioritize that while also experimenting and playing on the side.
Yeah. And then sprinkle a little bit of emphasis on personal health on top of that. And that itself is a big transition and should be acknowledged. And I'm glad you brought up the scenario of the hedge fund manager and his partner, because this is one of the boundaries that I like to push on when I'm speaking with somebody going through a transition, is because one of the common forms of resistance that I've noticed in folks is that there's a collection of sort of societal expectations, right? And the norm or the expectation in society is that you never get divorced, or that you always make the sacrifice for your partner, or that you always make the sacrifice for your kids. There are sort of these like sacred cows within a culture that a lot of people don't want to go by. And I bring up 2 examples where it challenges those sacred cows. And I think it's a healthy thing for somebody to challenge these things that are uncomfortable to consider, because it'll help them really formulate, to your question, what are you willing to do for this? And 2 examples. One is more recent. If anyone's ever read any of Pema Chodron's writings, she's the author of When Things Fall Apart, and she became well known in the world of mindfulness and spirituality because she is, I think, only female Buddhist nun, certainly in the United States.
In the United States, yeah.
And her prior story was, she had children. She was married. First marriage fell apart. She then was married again. The second one fell apart just in sort of sudden, dramatic, life-shattering fashion. And so she was in a very dark place. And she felt that something called her towards seeking the end of her own suffering. And that drew her towards a practice in Buddhism, which became a very serious practice. So much so that she made the choice to, at that point, I believe her children are sort of like early teens in general. She said, I must pursue this calling. So a mother leaving her children behind, in a sense, to pursue this calling towards a spiritual life. I can guarantee you she doesn't share a lot of details about this, but I'm sure she received an endless amount of judgment and resistance and criticism, not only within her family, but her friends and anyone else that was aware of this. Nonetheless, she did it. And those relationships have been reconciled and improved. There's an understanding now through the adult lens of her children. And obviously, answering that call was of significance because of the role that Pema has now played in the broad world of healing and mindfulness and the amount of people she helps. And the second story is actually the story of Siddhartha Gautama, the original Lord Buddha, right? This was somebody born in what's modern day Nepal as a prince into royalty, who was sheltered from the suffering of life, who at one point saw a brief glimpse of old age and illness, poverty, and suffering that then woke him up in a sense where he said, I need to see the totality of life because I'm sheltered in this princely, narrow vision of what it means to be alive. And so he left his princely life behind. He left the royalty, the position. He left his wife and his child. And he went and then suffered greatly for many years before it eventually unfolded in him sort of having his moment under the Bodhi tree where he meditated for
becoming enlightened
and having that enlightenment and establishing this notion of the middle way, that there's a balance to be achieved in life. It's not about all the riches. It's not about all the suffering. It's something in between. And he eventually returned to his family and he had to make amends. And so anyhow, I share these two examples because they are examples that go against the common cultural norms and expectations. And I'm not suggesting that everyone do this, that they throw their responsibilities aside, but they are really powerful examples. And I know of a few in my personal life that have made similar choices and navigated those choices. And that I just wanted to mention that in this conflict between these real world practicalities, often there's a form of resistance during transformation where it's actually fear that's masked as practicality that keeps us from making hard decisions that could lead to a true transformation. And it's something really worth exploring when somebody is thinking about making a big change in their life.
I love those stories. There's a question that I learned when I was studying with Jim and Diana. I think both Jim and Diana always ask it, but I think it speaks to what you just said, which is, what are you willing to risk for your full aliveness?
Yes.
And only you know what you're willing to risk for that, right? Pema Chodron was willing to risk her marriage and her identity as a mother in some respects. And there's countless other stories. And, I think when you ask yourself that question, the inverse of that question is, what aren't you willing to risk?
Yeah.
And you can learn a lot about yourself when you answer both of those questions as openly and honestly as you can, because as you just said, what's underneath that is oftentimes, lots of fear, and goes back to those four things that we talked about: approval, security, control, and unity, and afraid that we're going to lose those. And to me, there's a question also, which is, well, if you're unwilling to face that risk for your full aliveness, what's the payoff? Why do you keep on doing what you're doing? And maybe it's a great reason, like, I love my kids too much and I came from a certain kind of family, and I don't just because we're talking about divorce, I don't want my kids to have to live with divorced parents, and I'm willing to live with those implications.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'm unwilling to not go and do this thing, even if it means me getting in a series of fights with my partner, because this is just really important to me.
Yeah.
And I want to express how much I love them, how much the family means to me, and that we're going to work on this is going to be a partnership, and we're going to figure it out together. So there's a lot of different ways to navigate it.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I think it's a good way to sort of leave this conversation too. And for the high performers, the founders that are going to listen to this, as they sit there and start to contemplate, what are they willing to do to hold on to and to let go. There's no one answer to that. That is an individual quest. And that is the point of this transition and transformation in and of itself, is
Yeah.
defining this second mountain for you.
And I think that Silicon Valley, all due respect, it's the world that I came from. I owe a tremendous amount to it. But in this very rational, intellectual world where your job as an entrepreneur is to make hundreds of decisions every single day and have the answers to questions and to project this image that you have the answers. And one of the things that I'll say about these kinds of questions is that these aren't questions that have a single answer. These are questions that you sit with, that they emerge new understanding and new insights over long periods of time. And so for those listening, I would just encourage you to, rather than answer a question and believe that the answer is the answer, and just know that these questions you're sitting in and that the answers are unfolding as you're unfolding too.
It's awesome. I'm still sitting with a bunch of stuff myself, being sort of 5 years in, but I appreciate this conversation. It's been pretty eye-opening to me, especially a few of these new frameworks and the nuance that you introduced to it. So thank you, Steve.
Oh, we just scratched the surface. I mean, I feel like I could have talked about this for another hour. I would like to offer something for the listeners.
Yeah.
Which is, forget who I initially heard this from. This whole talk about transition reminds me of, obviously, and this isn't, my idea, but transition tends to use the metaphor of the caterpillar, the cocoon, and the butterfly, right? It's natural. If you look at the book Transitions by Bridges, the cover of the book has a butterfly. If you look at Frederick Hudson's, cycle of renewal, one of the 4 stages is the cocoon. And so any literature you read on transition inevitably will bring up this metaphor. And I'm going to leave you with a story, which is The Boy and the Butterfly. And the story goes like this. A young boy discovers a cocoon and becomes fascinated with the idea of helping the butterfly inside it emerge more quickly. He observes the struggle of the butterfly to break free from the cocoon and thinks that by breathing on it, he can assist the butterfly in its development. The boy blows on the cocoon, and indeed, the butterfly emerges sooner than it would have naturally. However, to the boy's dismay, the butterfly is weak and unable to fly properly. It soon becomes clear that the struggle to break free from the cocoon is a vital part of the butterfly's development. The process of pushing against the walls of the cocoon strengthens the butterfly's wings, enable it to fly once it emerges fully developed. Tragically, the butterfly is unable to fly and ultimately dies in the boy's hands due to its premature emergence. And I share that because a lot of the time we're the little boy, where we want things to move faster than nature wants to move. And we have to remember that nature is never in a hurry, but always accomplishes its job. And so what I would just offer everyone listening is take it easy on yourself, right? And really embrace this idea of unfolding and appreciating the process, not from you being out of control, but more around you discovering who you are, what lights you up, and ultimately, what is it that you want to express to the world.
I love that parable. And Steve, what's the best way for people to follow you along or get a hold of you and to follow on your work?
You can find me on Twitter at Schlaf, Schlaf, as in Frank, Schlaf, though I don't know how much longer I'm going to be on. I have multiple parts that get triggered on Twitter. And as my family and I were actually moving upstate to the Catskills permanently to live in nature, we're leaving New York after, 16 years. But for now, you can reach me at Schlaf. Please follow me there. You can also check out my website, schlaf.co, that talks a little bit more about my coaching. And then you can follow me on Substack. And the name of the publication is Where the Road Bends. I try to publish every week, though I'm taking a little bit of a break now, which I'm excited to, and recharge my creative muscles. And yeah, it's a labor of love. It is not content marketing. It is self-expression.
Right on. Well, thank you, Steve.
Thanks, brother.